Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 10, our last class in arn201. Well, in this class we're going to be having a look at a whole range of miscellaneous topics. Everything from stand-ins to environmental fog, make TX, AS files, kick, log files, loads of different things that really I couldn't find a way of putting into any other class easily, and therefore I've bundled them all into this. This is going to be, as I said, your miscellaneous class for all those bits and pieces. So let's begin by having a look at stand-ins, and we touched on this earlier in an earlier class, but we're just going to look at it again just so you can be familiar with it. Okay, so here we are in Maya. We're just going to load up the stand-in file. You can see it's a armadillo model here with a AI green shader applied to it. It's pretty high poly count. If we just have a look at the poly count overall, it's about 350,000 faces. So a lot of faces on there. Let's just turn that off. So the first thing we want to do with a stand-in is we actually want to convert this into a stand-in model. So we do that by going to Arnold, Stand-ins, Export. And up comes this dialog box. At the top you can choose the file format, and I usually, for Arnold, keep it with the Arnold file format, the AS file format here. And then you can specify what is actually going to be exported. So what do we want out of all of these options? Now we've obviously just got a model, so I can turn off some of these if I wanted to, but I'm going to leave them on just because it doesn't really affect anything. And also if I want to render a sequence, I can do that here. So I can say the start and end frame and the number of frames as I go. So obviously if this was on 2, I would render 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. But I just want to take one still model from here. So I'm going to go with my export, and it's looking for a name. So I'm just going to move to my main Maya folder. I'm going to make a new folder in here, and I'm just going to call this AS so that you know where those files are going to be. And I'm going to call this armadillo_01 or underscore stand-in. So we now can just make a new scene. Okay, so we're now in a fresh new Maya scene. We're then going to come up to Arnold, stand-in, create. You can see the first thing it does is it makes this little cube here. This is the stand-in. And we're going to load in that armadillo file. You can see it just changed size and jumped into the correct place that the armadillo was. Now we can actually see this in different ways. We could look at, say, polywire, a wireframe, shaded, or we could just go with a point cloud, which can often be really useful and quite low in kind of complexity, as you can imagine. You can zoom right in and there's the point cloud as you would expect. For this, I'm just going to go back to the bounding box. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to go with is a floor. So I'm going to make just a cylinder, and let's just bring that out somewhere around there, perhaps something like that. And we're going to go with, if we have a look here, let's just set this to say 0.5 and then come down to here, and let's make this a radius of say 12, height of 1, and say some subdivision of say 30. I'm thinking that height's way too much, so let's go with something like that. Okay, so that's going to be our floor. So I'm just going to bring this down so it's underneath here. Zoom on in. So somewhere like that. Okay, so let's just jump back to our perspective. Stay in wireframe mode. First thing we're going to do with this is we're going to move it back. So I'm just going to push it back, maybe somewhere like here. And then I'm going to do an edit, duplicate, and I'm going to move this one back to say here, and then I'm going to do an edit, duplicate again, and just move this one back to here. So now you can see we have 3 of these. Okay, and if we just look here and I do a quick Arnold render, make sure we're on Arnold, Now we're not going to see anything because I haven't made any lights, but what you will see is an alpha. So we jump across to the alpha channel. There's 1, 2, and here we're going to see the third armadillo just appearing. There he is. Okay, so they're all there, ready to go. So first off, let's take this first one and we're going to duplicate this 5 times. Edit, duplicate special. We're going to reset this. We're going to say we want instancing. We're going to say 72 degrees and 5 copies. And before we hit apply, I'm just going to move the pivot point back to the middle. And while I remember, I'm going to do that for all of them very quickly. Okay, so click back with this one, apply, and there we have those 5 copies. Okay, so if we come and have a quick look in our outliner, we see we've got our 1, 2, 3, 4, and in fact this one is overwritten, so I really only needed 4, so I'll get rid of that one. So we've got 5 there in the middle. I'm then going to select this one, modify this one, edit, duplicate special, 9, and this time we're going to go with 36, apply, and then this one we're going to go with 20, so that would be 19, and the rotation is 18 degrees for this instance. So let's apply that. You can see now we have made 34 copies of this. Okay, so there they all are. So if we now just move ourselves to somewhere like here, get into a position where we could see everything, maybe extend this out a little bit more. So let's just go with maybe a radius of say 24, something like that. And obviously it'd be good to give it a texture. So I'm just going to add a standard AI shader. I'm then going to come into my Arnold and just pop in a light. So a sky dome light would be great for this. The color, instead of keeping white, I'm going to use a texture. And for this one, we're going to use a physical sky texture. Now this has the ability to basically emulate different types of skies at different elevations, different positions, colors, etc. We're going to leave it all like this for the time being. And we're just going to zoom on in and let's now render our scene. Okay, so you can see that's now rendered in 29 seconds. If you remember, we started with a single character at 350,000 faces. Now we've times that up, and you can see I've times it by 34 times. That's approximately 12 million polygons. So in 29 seconds, we've rendered 12 million polygons, which I think is pretty impressive. Now, let's go back and have a very quick look at our physical sky, because we haven't covered that in any other classes, and it would be good to do that briefly. So in order to do this and make it work reasonably quickly, I'm just going to drop our res down here to maybe a very low amount, 530 by 300. Apologize for the small size, but it's going to just make life a little bit quicker. Now, in order to put this in the background, just to make it look a little bit nicer, I'm going to open up my render settings, and under here, environment, I've got background. And when I click here, you can see I've got my AI physical sky here. So I'm just going to click on that, and that's going to drop it in the background. So if I now render this, you can see there is my background. So just so we can really see what's going on. Okay, and I'm just going to budge this around. You can see it basically stops here. So I'm just going to adjust my scene just a little bit, trying to avoid getting that black line in, but we can deal with that later. So we've got plenty of sky now to look at. So the first thing we've got here is this setting that basically controls the overall dust, moisture, kind of ice and fog in the air. And this is a range of 1 to 10. Okay, so if you put it onto 10, you're ending up with a slightly hazy day. And if I bring it all the way down to somewhere like 1 or 2, this is very clear, it's kind of Arctic-like skies. So you can see the sky really clears up. Okay, so I live in England. It's usually a little bit moist, so I'm going to put it on a sunny, warm day, which doesn't happen very often here, but it is quite moist. So I'm going to put it on number 6. Okay. Next up, we've got this ground albedo, and what this does is this is the amount of light reflected from the planet's surface back into the atmosphere. Okay, and it's an RGB value, goes between 0 and 1. Okay, where 0 would basically correspond to a black ground and 1 would correspond to a white ground. Okay, so we're going to go with this kind of bluish color. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to try and emulate that slightly. So let's go somewhere around about here, this kind of color. Okay, and you can see the sky changing quite dramatically as we do that. Then we've got our elevation, and this is an angle of the sun from the horizon, and it ranges from 1 to 180. Okay, so for instance, let's say we want to put it down to 0. You can see everything goes black. And as we increase it, we basically push the sun higher and higher into the sky. And this has a dramatic effect on color as well. So here you can see we've really got kind of like a sunsetty look. And if I begin to increase it, we end up with kind of like a dawn, and it just becomes brighter. Now at the bottom, we've got here enable sun. So if we scoot round, we should eventually pick up where the sun is. So let's just scoot our scene around. There is the sun there just appearing. Okay, so now it makes more sense as I increase this. You can see the sun rising, and we're getting much nicer images. All the shadows are working really nicely for us as well, which is fantastic. Then we've got this number here. What this does is this is the angle of the sun around the horizon, and it's measured from the north, increasing towards the east from 0 to 360. So if I was to make this say 180, see the sun moves away. We bring it back to 45. See the sun has now moved across to the left hand side of the image, and as I continue to increase it, we'll see the sun coming round in our shot. So here it comes round 55, further and further it comes round into the scene. Okay, so we can position it this way if we want to, instead of actually moving our scene. Then we've got the overall intensity. So if we want to make it an incredibly sunny day, we can push our intensity right up to 5. If we want to make it not so sunny day, we could maybe make it 0.5. So you can see we get this really nice kind of sunsetty look again. I'm going to keep it back at just a value of 1, which seems to work quite nicely. And I'm probably going to take the elevation down to maybe 7.5, make it a little bit more dusky. Okay, so that is the physical sky that we have taking place there. Okay, so again, let's just move around and then do a full render just so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so that's the render finished. Took about 4 minutes, and I ended up going with this kind of a sunrise, sunset kind of image with all these armadillos kind of worshipping the sun, or whatever it is they're kind of doing in this position. Okay, so let me just go ahead and save that. So that's our stand-ins, our O2 with our physical sky added. Okay, so we're going to come in and we're going to load in our next scene, which is looking at the environment fog. Okay, so just an old model I had on file. Let's just do an IPR so we can just see what this is looking like. Okay, so I'm using again the physical sky, as we've looked at it once. Let's use it again, and you can see this is what we're getting as it just renders through. Now the fog is a really nice kind of atmospheric shader that basically simulates the effect of light scatter that causes more distant objects to appear, lower contrast, very good for kind of outdoor environments, that kind of thing. Okay, so you're getting a good idea as to what this is going to look like. While we're waiting, let's just call up our render settings. Let's bring those over here. Now, down in our Arnold render section, we're going to scoot down to the environment where we put the background in last time. So that's under here, environment. And you can see I've already got my physical sky in there, but here under atmosphere, we're going to click and we're going to create AI fog. Now once we do this, this opens up another section underneath that's in our attribute editor. And you can see we really don't have too many options. We have the color of the fog, we have the distance, the height, and then we've got a ground normal and a ground point set of numbers. Okay, so firstly, let's have a look at the color. Okay, now this is the actual color of the fog, and unsaturated values definitely work the best. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and let's make a kind of a foggy, bluey, grey color, something like that. Okay, probably a little bit more desaturated and dismal, maybe that kind of color. Okay, so there's the color of our fog. Now next up we have distance, and this controls the fog density. Okay, so the smaller the values makes the fog appear less dense, while larger values make it appear more dense. Okay, so if we go for a density of say 1, you can see these towers are beginning to now get fogged up. Let's go with a intensity of 10, and we're getting a little bit more. But the reason why this may not be working perfectly straight away is going to be to do with this ground normal. So I'm going to set this to 180. You can see immediately now we've done that, we now get a much more foggy scene. In fact, an incredibly crazy foggy scene. So let's now take the distance back down to 1 again. Now we're getting something. We're beginning to see through slightly. So again, let's drop this even more. Let's go with a value of say 0.1. Now we're really beginning to see what's going on. And our fog color doesn't quite look right to me, so I'm just going to adjust that slightly. Make it a little bit whiter and more saturated, say something like that. Okay. Now probably the obvious question is, what happened when I changed the ground normal to 180? Well, this basically determines the axis of the fog direction. So I've basically changed the fog direction in Y by 180. So I've swung it round so it's actually the right direction for where we are. Now the next thing we've got is the height, and this value changes the rate of the decay along the directional axis. Okay, so we've got height here. So what we want to do is we want to set it to, well, let's have a look. If we set it to something quite low, like 1, you can see now the fog is basically lying across the floor, but not going up too high. Let's go for something like 2. That's now looking much more realistic. We get this nice band coming across. Again, if we were to push this up really crazy high, say something like 20, you can see now the fog goes right up and we're ending up with this much more foggy look kind of across the whole thing, both in the depth and also in our height based on the directional axis. So I'm going to go with a value of about 5. Okay, so that looks much nicer. Now, the ground point, what this actually does is this determines the starting point for the fog along the axis in direction. Okay, so we're basically, if we wanted to, we can actually move the fog up. So let's say that we want the fog to start at, say, a value of 10 in Y. Now we've actually pushed the fog right up outside of our model, right up into the sky. If we set it to 1, you can now very clearly see where the fog is. It's kind of across the middle of this main building. Okay, so we're going to start it right down on the ground at 0, and then it lies flat on the ground. You could even say I want it to be just a little bit under the ground, 0.2, and now you're definitely going to guarantee that it's kind of got everything covered. Okay, so you've got a whole host of things that we can adjust here. It doesn't have to be a massive amount of controls to get a good result. And again, the big ones are the height and the distance. So again, if I wanted to make that fog a little bit more intense, I could just go with, say, a value of 0.2, and we're going to now lose a lot of our model in that fog. Okay, so there it all goes. Okay, way too much probably for what we want. So I'm going to go back to value of 0.115, and that gives us quite a nice result. Okay, so that is the AI fog, and I'm just going to close this up And in fact, I'll render this so you can see it before I close it, and then we'll move on. So I'll just put this onto render and let it run through, and then we'll close up the scene. Okay, so that's gone through, took about 38 seconds, and we're getting an image something like that. Okay, so that is our fog. So I'm just going to save that out as environment fog 02, and then let's load up our next scene, which is looking at atmospheric volume scattering. And for this I've got a very simple scene, which is basically a light looking through this kind of window down this tube. Okay, so this is a solid angle scene, which seems good to use for this. Okay, so we're going to open up our render settings here, and we're going to come down to our environment again, which we've been looking at over the last few bits and pieces. And under atmosphere, we're now going to go with AI volume scattering. Okay, now with that selected, let's have a quick look at what we're getting. Okay, so we'll let this render through. Okay, so firstly, we have this volume attribute section where we have color and density. Now the density basically increases or decreases the amount of atmospheric volume that we're going to be seeing. So if we go for something reasonably low, 0.4, you can see that in this scene we're getting quite then an intense amount of that, and that's going to be due partly to the size of the scene. So let's really bring that down, 0.04 or 0.05. Now you can really begin to see those lights coming through and the beams that we're getting through the volume. And even this might be too much, but I'll go with it. I'm going to go with a slightly different color. So we're going to click on our color, and let's go with, again, one of our kind of blue colors. Now next up, we've got attenuation color and attenuation. Okay, the attenuation control is multiplied by this RGB value. Okay, so a red value here means red light is attenuated. Okay, so let's go in and we're going to just keep this as white, and let's go in and start increasing the attenuation. And you see as we do that, attenuation, as we know, is the fall off of that. So if I was to put the attenuation up reasonably high, something like 1, you see we're going to lose a lot of this nice volume that we've got in here. Okay, so there, we're reducing it quite dramatically with that. Now I tend to keep it at something around 0.65, something like that. Seems to work quite nicely. Then you've got the ability to do anisotropic, which obviously will adjust the shape in which we're seeing, and then the volume samples as well. Now under the attributes here, we then have camera, diffuse and reflection, and this deals with basically the contribution to each one of these. So firstly we have camera, and this affects how much the volume scatter affects the camera rays. So if we drop this down to 0.1, we're going to get very little effect on our camera rays. I'm going to again put this back up to 1 so it has full effect. The diffuse is the degree in which the volume scatter affects the diffuse GI rays. So if we were to increase that, you can see we're now getting a lot more in that diffuse ray setup. And then the reflections, this is how much the volume scatter affects the reflection and glossy rays. Okay, so if you want your kind of cone of light to be seen in things like reflective surfaces, mirrors, etc., you're going to want to put this up at 1. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there at 1 for the time being, which is what we need, though we don't really have anything too reflective in the scene. Okay, so that is really all we have to it. So it's pretty straightforward. You can get some really nice results. Again, I'm just going to increase my intensity a little bit here, my density of my volume fog overall. So let's go with 0.075. Push up my attenuation just a little bit as well. And then let's let this render through properly just so we can see what we're getting. Okay, so that's finished rendering. Took about 4 minutes 50 seconds. You can see we're getting a really nice result. A little bit noisy still, so we may want to increase our samples to something higher than 10, maybe 20 would be a sensible number. But generally you can see we're getting a really nice scene from this volume scattering. So let me just go ahead and save that. Just call this volume scattering 02. And now let's move over to having a look at make TX. Okay, in this next section, we're going to be looking at make TX and the use of log files and how they can help you debug things. So first off, let's have a look at the file we're going to be using. So I'm just going to come in and load it. It's called make TX01. And what we've basically got here is just a card with a texture map on. So if I go ahead and render that, you can see this is what it's looking like. Now, in order, first off, to get the console working, we need to output one of these log files. So we do that by opening up our render settings. We first of all say that the log needs to be set to debug. We want to output to a file, and I just want to output this to my desktop. And I'm just calling it Arnold log. Okay, so it's set to debug, save to file, save the file name here, and then we can go ahead and render again. Now you can see as it's rendering through that our console is now filling up with information. Okay, so once it's finished, which will be very soon, there we go. Let's just close these down. In fact, I'll just move this over so we've got it on screen, but it's not in the way. We can see in here everything that's happened during that render session. So all the shaders and things that have been loaded, lots of different things going on. There's the actual render itself taking place. And then as we come down here, this is where we get to the interesting part, which is here. Okay, so first off, we can see that we have some images. And the main thing that we're interested in here is this peak cache memory. And you can see with the OpenEXR file, it's basically 105 megabytes. Also down here, we can see that we have one file is not a mipmap. So it's coming up with a warning there telling us that one file isn't a mipmap. And we can also see here the name of the file that we're using. Okay, so that's the OpenEXR there. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to use make TX to basically convert this OpenEXR to a .tx file, and then we're going to have a look at how much smaller this is and how that helps us. So remember we had a 14-second render. I'm just going to save that, and it used 105 megabytes. So what we're going to do is we're going to come across to Arnold, and we're going to come to TX Manager. And in here, we're simply going to grab the file texture that's available to us. Now this is here because the make TX Manager is basically worked out that there's something in our file that's a texture map, which is this Macbeth chart, and that's what it's going to convert once I've highlighted it. Now if I wanted to, I could actually use textures in a folder and basically convert a whole bunch of textures at once, but I'm just going to go with saying convert what I've got here in my scene. Now it uses some options here, and these ones I just tend to leave as is, and I will put in the download file the page from the website that says what all these are. So with this selected, I'm literally just going to say make TX, and it's gone across and it said it's created one of one. So I can now close this. The job is now done. And if I now open up the texture map, so I'm going to grab this, open up the texture. You can see in here that we now have our 32-bit Macbeth chart, but this time it's a TX file. So I'm going to load that. Okay, so remember where we were before. We had a 40-second render or thereabouts. Let's just check. 14 seconds rather, 14 seconds and about 105 megabytes. So let's now re-render this with our new TX file in place. So we'll just hit render. You can see our Arnold log file is updating. It's going through that render. We can see already it feels like it's going quicker. So let's see if it really is. So it's gone now to 13 seconds. So it was definitely faster. And we can see here that the peak cache memory was only 37 megabytes. So simply converting that file has meant that we've been using with the EXR file 105 megabytes, and with this new file we're now using only 37.3 megabytes. You'll also note that down here we've got no warnings that are telling us that we now don't have a bitmap file. And also here you can see that we've now got that 32-bit file being sourced. Okay, so everything now is working. Now if you actually want to do this in the command line, you can, of course. Let me just show you how you do that. So here's my command line. I'm just going to move across to where I keep my solid angle information. So I'm just going to go into my M2A folder, and I keep everything in M2A here. And if we go in even further to bin, you can see there is my make tx file. So as an example, I've just pasted a version in here that you can just see what we've got going on. If I just stretch this out. So this is my make tx file. I've got a whole bunch of different checkboxes in here that do different things. You can see I'm saying what kind of filtering I'm using, path name to the original file I want to use, and then also the path name to the tx file that I want to use as well. So a whole bunch of different things you can do here, and if I was to run this with obviously the files in place, that would also convert that from this particular instance of TIFF file across to the tx file. Okay, so it's well worth doing that, and it's well worth, as I said, keeping an eye on your Arnold log file as well, just so you can see exactly what's going on there. So that is the log files and the make tx. So from here, let's go across and look at the as file and how we can use kick. Okay, I'm just going to load one of the files we looked at earlier. I'm going to look at my stand-in here. Now, in order to make a .as file, it's pretty straightforward. All we do is we go to File, Export, and you can either export obviously a selection or everything, just the same as you can normally. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to go back to my Maya folder, to my as here, and I'm going to come to my as exporter, ASS. Same export functionality that we talked about earlier, but I'm really just exporting the whole scene now. So I'm just going to call this as export.ass, and I'm going to export that out. And what that's basically doing is exporting the entire scene. So if we have a look at that, here is that as export file. It's about 19K, and what it's doing is it's referring back to the Maya project. So it's important that everything kind of stays in place, otherwise things do get a little bit confusing. Okay, from here, let's go ahead and load up the terminal. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the kick command to now load that as file. So we're actually going to kick as, which I always find quite amusing. So this is the command we're going to use. Basically just calls the kick command -i to render, and then this is the file that we're rendering. I've copied it over to my desktop just for ease. So if I hit enter, it loads up Arnold and begins to render that. So you can see that going through in their buckets. Okay, and that will just render until it's finished, and then we would be able to do whatever we want with it. Now, at the moment you can see that we have this issue that it's actually rendering linear, and so this is darker than we would want it to be as we're viewing it on a monitor, which is obviously a gamma 2.2. So one of the things we're going to need to do is add into this a command to adjust the gamma. So here is the file path that we've used, and what we're going to do is we're going to add in something in here to adjust the gamma. So let's just call up the information on kick so we can see how we do that. Okay, so here on this page there's a lot of kind of examples of things we can do. And if we scoot down, we can see here we can add a gamma of 2.2 to the output using this -G flag. And as before, there's lots and lots of different types of flags we can use. So we're going to open up this, and at the end we're going to put -G and then that 2.2. So if we stretch that out, that's what it's going to look like. So let's get rid of that, bring this in. copy that and just close this down. This we can shut down and paste this back in with the minus G 2.2 render, and you can see now we're getting that gamma correction, and it's much more close to what we saw when we did this in Maya. Okay, so that's using the command line kick to run our AS files. Now, short of doing this on the command prompt all the time, there's a little utility that I have for the Mac that enables us to do this with a little bit more flair, simply because we've ended up with a front UI which can be much more helpful. So I'm just going to load that now. Here it is, and you can see in here we've got our 2.2 gamma that we talked about. In fact, it would be this one, the output gamma 2.2. So I'm going to browse for the file. There it is, as export. I could then, if I wanted to, come in and make a whole bunch of overrides simply using the same kind of tags that we looked at earlier, minus G for gamma, for instance, or ones for AA, diffuse samples, glossy samples, etc. Leaving all these off will basically just go through and render it as was. Okay, so if I now hit render, again, we're getting a very similar thing coming up. There's the render going through. Here's kind of the output, and we can see how that's going. If we want to, we can then kill that at any point and make a change. So that is how we can use our exported ASS file with the command kick to get these out. Now, if you end up moving your Maya file somewhere else and you just end up with your AS file on its own, what you're going to find is that it's basically not going to be able to find some of the textures and things like that. So you want to make sure, as I said earlier, that everything remains the same in the same files, in the same folders, etc. That way you'll know that everything's going to be working just fine. Okay, so I think that probably brings us to the end of this class. We've looked at stand-ins, we've looked at environment fog, we've looked at atmospheric volume scatter, we've looked at physical sky, we've looked at make, TX, we've looked at AS files, kick, and log files. So we've covered lots and lots of different bits and pieces over the course of this class, and in fact over the course of the entire course itself. So I hope you've enjoyed it. It's definitely been fun to go through everything with you. Any questions, keep them in the forums. I will obviously continue to be in the forums, so I'll keep an eye on that. If time has gone on and you want to contact me, obviously direct message me, and that would be great. But until the next class, as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.